Thank you all for coming to this. It's actually a talk that's gotten some interest lately. I'm very happy to give it here as well. One second. Okay, there we are. So about me, I have been working with Postgres longer than almost everybody else in this conference. I have almost 27 years of experience with Postgres. Bruce has more than me. And I've worked in many, many different ways. A lot of what I've done has been advocacy, as well as one code contribution, a bunch of work doing, documenting cool things you can do with Postgres, all that kind of thing. So in this talk, although we're going to have descriptive discussions about some geopolitical controversies, this talk does not take sides in any of them. The reason is, a lot of these things look very different depending where you're looking at them from, right? And one of the big topics that we're going to talk about is the dangers that come with this these geopolitical shifts, especially if we lock ourselves into one side's viewpoint or another. So this is not something that's taking sides in any of these controversies, but it is a topic that's aimed at exploring both what's going on, how it impacts PostgreSQL adoption as well as development going forward, and things we need to watch for as a community, as well as reasons why continuing to use Postgres really makes a lot of sense in these contexts. So here I have a timeline, and the timeline, well, it's a little out of date because it was from last year, but basically it goes from the end of World War II largely to the present. And when I gave this talk the first time, I gave it in Nepal, and then I gave it in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But there are a few things that have happened since then that I'm just going to have a quick note about. But the key thing is that from the end of World War II until 1989, we basically had this thing called the Cold War, which some people at this conference at least probably remember. 2 years later, after that was negotiated to an end mutually by both sides, the USSR fell. And you had basically at that point, the United States at that point believed that they had won the Cold War and basically set out to remake the world along the lines that they believed would be beneficial for everybody, but of course that's very self-serving. We have trouble separating our own self-interests from interests of everybody. So in 1996, negotiations began between China and Russia that in 1997 led to this thing called the Joint Declaration on the New International Order and the multipolarity and the New International Order. So this was the sort of beginning to what eventually led to BRICS. In 2013, we have One Belt, One Road. One Belt, One Road effectively removed the sort of joint monopoly that the International Monetary Fund and World Bank had for funding projects in less developed countries. In 2022, we have the fact that the world order shifted in very large ways when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out. And finally, we find ourselves here at the present, also now dealing with a lot of uncertainty, especially when we look at the fact that now we have the war with Iran as well. And I'm not going to talk about the war with Iran primarily because, well, I understand where a lot of the rest of it's going in this regard. I don't know where that one's going. So let's talk about how open source software kind of became big and why it was tied to this era of unipolarity. So the United States, after the USSR fell, basically started to try to globalize the world economy. And the reason they did so was because a lot of the Western economies had been built up during this time of colonialism, and so they had become really dependent upon these natural resource imports, as well as selling back improved products at a premium, and this both allows you to accumulate money, wealth, and basically remove it from the rest of the world, right? But what's required in doing this is you have a need for two things. First of all, you have a need for communications, because if you're sending a letter by even airmail internationally, and it takes 2 weeks, and then it takes time to, maybe clarify what that order is, or you have to call people in the middle of the night, things like that. That makes it very, very hard to globalize the economy. So communications improvements were absolutely critical here. And the second thing that was really important to make that communication side work was improving the market for personal computers. So it was really during this time period that all of the major open source software projects really came to the fore. So, and I just want to note here in a moment that that this is true, that almost all of the major open source software projects became major community projects in that time. So 1991 for Linux. 1995 for Postgres, even though the code base goes back to 1985, right? It didn't become a community project until 1985. No, sorry, 1995. So the thing now, of course, is that globalization looks different from different sides, right? It looks one way if you're in the US or Europe. It looks something very different if you're here in China. It looks something very different yet again if you're in, say, Nepal or Indonesia or, say, Brazil, Argentina, and so forth, right? And so I want to just kind of talk about what it looks like from different sides, because that becomes kind of important as far as understanding these other trends. Yeah, so if you're in Western countries, it looks great because you get cheap imports. If you're in the countries that are making these, it may kind of look nice initially, but very oftentimes the cost is that your own economies continue possibly to suffer because of the power of, for example, the institutions that are trying to make sure that they can extract wealth and things like that. And then you have this next problem, which probably people have thought about. Sanctions, right? So one of the ways in which you see control maintained through this time period, and certainly into the present, is with the use of sanctions. And when you look at this, they go up, they almost never go down, because adding sanctions is easy, removing them is difficult. This is true everywhere. Now, this only goes through 2019. By now, that I believe is 3 to 4 times higher. It's the peak than it is in this graph. Okay. And we're just looking at US sanctions here. European sanctions are similar, Swiss sanctions are similar. You have a lot of things in that line. And we'll talk a little bit about this, because this is actually really important for Postgres adoption and open source adoption, because sanctions impact financial transactions. They do not impact use of open source software. So open source software itself is a very large sanctions hedge. If you're worried about sanctions, you build your infrastructure on open source software, because that reduces your risk quite a lot. So other downsides that we see from many other parts of the world is we see, for example, what I call manifest destiny mentality, which is the idea, particularly from the United States, that we just simply need to turn the rest of the world into a carbon copy of the United States and everybody will have peace and prosperity. And of course, I think most of us know by now that doesn't work. You also have the same perpetuation of the power structures that led to extraction of wealth during the colonial era. These became manifest in the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. And while all three of those organizations have become less severe now, they've largely become less severe because they've become less powerful. The last thing is that a lot of this relies on powerful countries exercising some restraint, at least to tell the world that, hey, it's better if you just follow us. And as we start to get into the present moment, what you'll see is that that restraint has disappeared, right? So, just a quick history here of de-risking. So in 1990, in the United States, we had this thing called the crypto wars. This basically involved a bunch of legal battles and legislative battles over export restrictions on cryptography. Those lasted until 1996, when cryptography was removed from the munitions list. 1997, we see the joint declaration by Russia and China on multipolarity. 1998, NATO-Russia relations suffer after NATO bombed Serbia. And this is actually a really big one because the United States position was we can use international law to justify it. And even the UK was saying, no, international law does not permit this. So 2013, we see One Belt, One Road, the end of the IMF and World Bank monopoly. 2016, we see major electoral upsets in the United States and UK with Brexit and with the first election of Trump. 2019, we see Trump paralyzing the World Trade Organization dispute system. 2022, we see the Russia-Ukraine war breakout, and in 2023, we see Indonesia respond to this by basically de-risking government operations from MasterCard and Visa. So, major thing to note here is that many of these things have unpredictable consequences, and because they have unpredictable consequences, they these things can go in ways that don't necessarily those who initiate actions don't necessarily get to control the outcomes. So now let's just talk quickly about open source software. So in an open source software context, we have questions about what do US sanctions require. This will actually become a really important topic when we talk about Linux in a moment. We're also going to talk about what EU sanctions require. You know, if you can't license components of ERP systems to, for example, Russian sanctioned entities, then can you contribute to Postgres, since Postgres is a component of an ERP system? Or, of course, nobody will interpret it that way, because if you do, then European firms that want to sponsor Postgres development can't pay for it in Europe. They have to pay for it in India, because then the global license isn't a problem. But these sorts of ambiguities cause problems, and people start looking at them and they ask, what is required from me? And, you know, the lawyers will give them answers to stay safe rather than realistic answers. So in 2023, we had a major shot across the bow in the United States. There was an effort to ban TikTok through an act called the Restrict Act. That act did not pass, a different act passed later. But the Restrict Act would have basically it basically said the US government could designate critical infrastructure, and then for critical infrastructure could then basically ban foreign adversaries from having any controlling interest. When you look at covered entities, it included any group of people, whether or not organized for profit, and controlling interests would have included things like git commit privileges. So the way I read this was that it would have given the government an ability to, the US government, an ability to basically say, oh, well, we're using Postgres in the military and therefore we can't allow Chinese committers or Russian committers or whatever. That did not pass because of a lot of efforts by industry, but I think that it indicates that there is a movement to try something like that at some point. And then in 2023 and 2024, we have the Linux maintainers purge. 2023, we have Baikal Electronics submitting a patch for something on the networking stack and basically being told, go away, don't submit anything else to us ever until we tell you otherwise. We're uncomfortable accepting patches from you. And there was some discussion on this, but it didn't really go that far in 2024. However, the Linux project basically purged maintainers whose employers were on US sanctions lists. And these were mostly Russian employers. People were usually saying, oh, it's about Russia. It was specifically about applying US sanctions to Linux contributions. And I actually tracked down lawyers involved in this and talked to them and got confirmation that, in fact, it definitely was the specially designated nationals list that they had chosen to apply. And again, this issue is, what do sanctions require of us? We don't know, so our lawyers say play it safe, so that's what they did. So from here, there are several major ways in which open source software plays into this. Open source software is very hard to sanction, primarily because the open source part of it doesn't involve monetary compensation. It is freely published, and it tends to be something much more like academic papers in terms of regulation than it is commercial transactions, and therefore everybody can just go ahead and use it, right? So it's very hard to sanction. It's an important sanctions hedge. Everybody wants to protect themselves, but countries oftentimes want to enhance their own competitiveness by restricting access to technologies to those they consider their adversaries. And that doesn't work very well at all with free and open source software. But there is another legitimate concern that comes up, and that is the fear that state actors could add backdoors to free and open source software. There's been some thinking that the OpenSSH vulnerability that Andres Freund found in, may have been a state actor, unknown which state that might have been. But we have seen state actors do major cyber attacks in the past. Probably the most famous is the Stuxnet attack, probably by Israel. And so, this is a risk that countries have to deal with. And when it comes to free and open source software, this is probably the one that they use to justify things like trying to say who can contribute. But it doesn't necessarily work very well because, that guy contributing in Kazakhstan, do you know if he's, maybe being paid by one intelligence agency or another to do something? You don't know that, right? And even if he was, you wouldn't know which side it is, right? And so this whole process breaks down rather catastrophically. So when I look at this, a lot of people ask me, what happened to the Linux kernel happen to Postgres? And I can't say it's impossible. But I can say it'd be a lot more difficult. Several things made Linux very susceptible. These included complete dependence on a US foundation. Postgres doesn't have that dependence. Postgres has a geographically distributed core team, although a bare majority of them are in the United States. 4 out of the 7 members. So in theory, it might be possible to try to go after these individuals to get them to, push something, but in practice, it's a lot harder. And then on top of this, because there is a large consensus culture within Postgres, it makes it very hard. It makes it much harder to push something through without there being the time and effort to really discuss it ahead of time. So, as long as there's a consensus culture, it also means a bare majority can't just easily and, without major repercussions, implement something because they're told by one government to do so. So from Postgres' perspective, I think that we're dealing with something that's relatively low risk when it comes to being pushed into doing something like the Linux kernel was. So my view on this, at least for Postgres, is that the future looks bright. And I would add that there's another aspect to this too, and that is that if I were looking at Linux, or if you're looking at something like Linux, and you're faced with this issue of, okay, well, you're kicked out of the contribution space, then yes, you can fork it, but Linux development is very rapid, it's very chaotic, and it's not very well directed, right? And so forking Linux is a lot of work, and managing a lot of this stuff in this context is a lot of work, right? On the other hand, like Postgres is something where you have a lot of companies which do maintain their own forks. They're used to working together on it. And consequently, you know, even the worst case scenarios are not nearly as bad. So when I say the future looks bright, I think the future looks very bright. I will also tell you that this is the only slide that I got negative feedback for when I gave this presentation in St. Petersburg. They said I was too optimistic. But I am optimistic on this, and so, yeah. You're welcome to reach out to me at any point, and thank you for this. If there are questions, if I have time for them, I'm happy to take them. All right, well then, I hope you found this interesting and thought-provoking, and thanks so much.